The charity gala was being held in the grand ballroom of the city's oldest hotel, a place where the walls were painted a soft gold and the floors were so polished they acted like mirrors. It was the kind of event where people didn't just go to be seen, they went to compare how much they had achieved since the last time they met. The air inside was thick and warm, filled with the smell of expensive perfume, the sharp tang of champagne, and the heavy scent of too many lilies arranged in tall vases. Everywhere you looked, there were people dressed in their finest clothes, laughing just a little bit too loudly, as if trying to convince everyone else that they were having the best time of their lives. Arthur stood near the back of the room, close to a large set of windows that looked out onto the street. He was holding a small glass of water with both hands, as if he were afraid that if he let go with one hand, he might drop it. He was an older man, probably in his late 70s, with hair that had turned thin and white, combed carefully to the side. His suit was clean, but it looked like it had been bought many years ago. The style was different from the sleek, modern cuts the younger men were wearing. The jacket was a little loose on his shoulders, and the trousers had a sharp crease down the front that had been pressed in with great care at home. He didn't look like he belonged in a room full of millionaires. He looked like someone who had saved up for months just to afford the ticket to get in. Around him, conversations swirled like eddies in a stream. People were talking about stock markets, vacations in Europe, and new cars. Arthur didn't join in. He just listened, his eyes moving slowly from face to face. He wasn't looking at the jewelry or the watches, he was watching the people. He saw the way a man patted his wife's hand absent-mindedly while looking for someone more important to talk to. He saw the way a young woman checked her phone every 10 seconds, bored by the older people around her. Arthur took a small sip of his water and felt a pang of loneliness in his chest. It wasn't a sharp pain, just a dull ache that reminded him he was alone in a crowded room. The center of attention that night was supposed to be the music. A grand piano, black and shiny as a pool of oil, sat on a raised platform at the front of the room. A young pianist, a man with perfectly styled hair and a tuxedo that looked like it cost more than Arthur's car, was sitting at the keys. He was playing a piece that was incredibly difficult. His fingers moved like lightning, striking the keys with precision and speed. The notes cascaded down like a waterfall, fast and furious. Most of the guests were only half listening, using the music as a background noise to their own chatter, but every now and then, someone would stop and nod appreciatively at the sheer speed of the pianist's hands. Arthur watched the young man closely. He didn't watch with envy, he watched with a strange kind of sadness. He saw that the young player was hitting every note perfectly. There were no mistakes. The rhythm was exact. Yet, to Arthur's ears, the music sounded empty. It was like looking at a beautiful plastic flower. It had all the colors and shapes of a real bloom, but it had no scent. It was cold. The young man was focused entirely on showing the audience how fast he could play, how technical he could be, but he wasn't telling a story. Arthur remembered a time when music wasn't about showing off. It was about feeling. It was about bleeding your heart out onto the keys so that the people listening didn't just hear sound, but felt an emotion. The pianist finished the piece with a dramatic flourish, lifting his hands high in the air. The room broke into polite applause. A few people clapped loudly, but most just tapped their glasses together and murmured, "Bravo," without really meaning it. The pianist stood up, bowed with a practiced smile, and then signaled to the host that he was taking a short break to stretch his fingers and get a drink. He walked off the stage, leaving the piano empty. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The background music was gone, replaced by a sudden increase in the volume of voices. Without the music to fill the gaps, the laughter seemed louder and shriller. People drifted closer to the open bar. It was that awkward time in the evening when the formal entertainment had paused, but the dinner hadn't been served yet. Everyone was looking around, trying to find someone to talk to who could advance their career or boost their social standing. Arthur looked at the empty piano bench. It sat there under the bright spotlight, looking lonely and inviting. It had been years, decades, really, since he had sat at a piano. He had played in cheap bars, in hotel lobbies, and at family gatherings when he was younger. He had played when his wife was alive, late at night in their small living room while she sat in her rocking chair and sewed. He had promised himself he would never play again after she passed away, because the music just hurt too much without her there to listen. But tonight, standing in this room full of people who seemed to have everything but felt like they had nothing, Arthur felt a pull. It was a magnetic pull in his chest. He took a deep breath and finished his water. He placed the glass on a small table near the wall. He felt his heart begin to beat a little faster, a nervous rhythm against his ribs. "Don't be silly, Arthur," he whispered to himself. "You're an old man. You don't belong up there." But his feet moved before his mind could stop them. He took a step away from the safety of the wall. Then another. He walked through the crowd, weaving between groups of people holding champagne flutes. At first, nobody noticed him. He was just an old man in an old suit, moving like a ghost through the party. But as he got closer to the front of the room, heads began to turn. The path to the stage was clear, and it became obvious that he was heading for the piano. Arthur climbed the 3 shallow steps that led up to the platform. His knees ached a little with the effort, and he held onto the railing to steady himself. The spotlight hit his face, blinding him for a moment. He squinted against the bright light and saw the room stretching out before him, a sea of curious faces. He sat down on the bench. It was firm and padded, smelling faintly of lemon polish. He placed his feet on the pedals, feeling the metal cold against the soles of his shoes. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, not pressing them down, just touching the ivory and wood to remind himself of the texture. A silence started to spread from the front of the room, moving backward like a ripple in a pond. It wasn't a respectful silence yet. It was a confused silence. People stopped talking to look at him. They whispered to each other. "Who is that? Is he part of the act? He looks like a waiter." A few men in the front row, who had had a bit too much to drink, began to chuckle. They pointed at his ill-fitting suit and his stooped shoulders. The laughter wasn't mean exactly, but it was dismissive. They thought he was a joke, a confused old man who had wandered up the wrong stairs. Arthur ignored them. He closed his eyes for a second and let the room fade away. He didn't hear the snickering. He didn't see the pitying looks. In his mind, he wasn't in a ballroom anymore. He was back in his living room, and the only person listening was the one person who mattered. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the stale air of the banquet hall, and prepared to speak the only language he had ever truly loved. The music was already there, waiting inside his fingers to be let out. The whispers started as a low hum, barely noticeable over the shuffling of feet and the clinking of ice in glasses, but they grew quickly. It wasn't the kind of hush that falls when a famous celebrity walks into a room, it was the confused murmur of a crowd trying to figure out a mistake. People craned their necks to get a better look at the stage. From the back of the hall, Arthur looked small and frail against the massive black curve of the grand piano. The spotlight, usually a friend to the performer, cast harsh shadows that highlighted the wrinkles on his face and the thinness of his white hair. He looked less like a musician and more like a lost grandfather who had wandered away from his family in search of a restroom. The real trouble began near the front. A group of young men, dressed in tuxedos that were tailored to fit their athletic builds perfectly, had been standing together with their dates. They were the kind of men who commanded attention in any room they entered, loud and confident, used to the world moving out of their way. One of them, a tall man with a perfectly groomed beard, was the first to laugh. It wasn't a quiet chuckle, it was a sharp, barking sound of genuine amusement that cut through the ambient noise of the room. "Look at this," he said, nudging his friend with his elbow and pointing a finger directly at the stage. "I think the entertainment staff has finally lost it. They've let a grandfather up there." His friend, a shorter man with a wide grin, looked at the stage and then back at his drink. "Maybe he's tuning it," he suggested, though his tone was dripping with sarcasm. "Or maybe he's going to play us a lullaby. I could use a nap after all this standing around." The group of women with them giggled behind their hands, covering their mouths to hide their smiles, but their eyes danced with mockery. They saw the old suit, the worn shoes, and the trembling hands of the old man, and they made a snap judgment. In their world, appearance was everything. If you didn't look the part, you couldn't play the part. They saw a janitor, a bus driver, or perhaps a confused guest who had consumed one too many glasses of wine. The idea that this man might actually possess the right to be on that stage seemed absurd to them. The laughter rippled outward like a stone thrown into a pond. Others in the nearby tables picked up on the joke. Heads turned, eyes rolled, and smirks were exchanged. It was cruel, but it was a lazy kind of cruelty. They weren't trying to be mean-spirited villains, they were just bored and privileged, looking for something to break the monotony of the evening. An old man at a piano was the punchline they didn't know they needed. Arthur sat very still on the bench. He could hear them. His hearing might not have been what it was when he was a boy, but the frequency of human laughter cuts through everything. He heard the word grandfather drift up from the front row. He heard the snickering. He felt the heat of 100 eyes on him, most of them filled with pity or ridicule. For a fleeting second, his hands froze over the keys. Doubt, that old and familiar enemy, gripped his heart. What was he doing? This was a mistake. He was about to make a fool of himself in front of all these important people. He should stand up, apologize, and shuffle back to the safety of the shadows near the windows. But then he looked down at the keys. They were white and black, stark and absolute. They didn't care about his suit. They didn't care about his age or his thinning hair. They only cared about pressure and vibration. He thought about the years he had spent not playing, the silence in his house, the way the dust had settled on the upright piano he had sold for a fraction of its worth years ago. He remembered the promise he made to himself that he would never touch the keys again, and he realized that breaking that promise was the only way to honor the memory of the life he had before. He shifted his weight on the bench, the leather creaking softly. He didn't turn around to face the audience. He didn't raise a hand to ask for silence. He just straightened his back, pulling his shoulders up as tall as he could manage. It was a small movement, a simple adjustment of posture, but it was a wall going up. He was separating himself from them. He was stepping out of the role of the confused old man and stepping into the role of the musician. The hired pianist, the young virtuoso who had been playing earlier, was standing off to the side of the stage near the heavy velvet curtains. He was holding a small white towel, wiping the sweat from his palms. He watched the scene unfold with a mix of annoyance and embarrassment. He took pride in his craft. He had practiced for hours a day since he was 5 years old to master the instrument. To see some unshaven, elderly man casually sitting at his instrument, his tool of the trade, felt disrespectful. He viewed it as someone mocking the hard work and discipline it took to be a real artist. He walked a few steps closer to the piano, intending to intervene. He was ready to tap Arthur on the shoulder and whisper that this area was restricted, or perhaps ask the security staff to gently escort the man away. He felt a responsibility to the venue and to the art form. But before he could reach the edge of the platform, something in Arthur's demeanor made him stop. The young pianist saw how Arthur held his hands. They weren't flailing about. They weren't slapping the keys in a random, drunken way. They were hovering, suspended in the air, perfectly still. The fingers were curled, the wrists slightly raised. It was the posture of a master. It was the same posture the young pianist used himself before a difficult passage. It was the posture of someone who is listening to the music in their head before they play it out loud. The young musician paused, his towel forgotten in his hand. A frown creased his forehead. He knew that look. He knew that stillness. In the audience, the laughter was starting to die down, not because of respect, but because the joke was getting stale. The man in the front row who had made the first comment took a sip of his drink, losing interest now that the old man wasn't doing anything funny. "Play chopsticks!" Someone shouted from the back of the room, causing a fresh ripple of giggles. "Play us a waltz!" Another voice chimed in. Arthur ignored them. He took a long, slow breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, expanding his ribcage. He imagined the air was the music itself, flowing into him and waiting to be released. He stretched his fingers wide, feeling the joints pop slightly. The arthritis in his hands had been bothering him lately, a dull throb in his knuckles when it rained, but tonight, his hands felt surprisingly loose. The warmth of the spotlight seemed to soak into his skin, loosening the tension. He decided he wouldn't play what they expected. He wouldn't play a classical piece to show them he was educated, and he wouldn't play a jazz number to show them he was cool. He would play the truth. He would play the only song that mattered. It was a melody he hadn't played for anyone in 30 years. It was a simple song, really, not technically difficult, but it required something that money couldn't buy. It required vulnerability. The room continued its chatter. The waiters were moving between the tables, pouring wine. The clinking of silverware against china resumed as people realized the old man wasn't going to do anything interesting. They dismissed him. They turned their backs to the stage, returning to their conversations about stocks and vacations. Arthur looked down one last time. He saw the reflection of his own face in the shiny black lacquer of the piano. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He wasn't doing this for them. He wasn't doing this to prove them wrong. He was doing it because the music was inside him, and if he didn't let it out, he felt like he might burst. He was doing it for the woman who used to sit in the chair in the corner of his living room, sewing while he played. He was doing it for the silence that had lived in his house for too long. He lowered his hands. The laughter from the front row rose up again as the man with the beard made another crude joke. It was the last thing Arthur heard before he let the world go. He tuned out the voices, the clinking glasses, the mockery. He touched the first key. It was a low A, deep and resonant. He didn't press it hard, he just grazed it, letting the sound bloom like a dark flower in the quiet air of his mind. It was the signal. The warning shot. The moment of no return. When Arthur's finger finally pressed down on that key, the sound wasn't at all what the crowd expected. There was no clumsy thud, no awkward fumble of fingers searching for the right note. Instead, the piano sang. It was a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards and up the legs of the chairs. It was a sound that felt heavy, like a stone dropped into a deep well. The note hung in the air, clear and steady, cutting through the stuffy atmosphere of the banquet hall. For a split second, the laughter from the front row didn't stop. They were too busy laughing at their own jokes to notice that something had changed. The young man in the tuxedo was still chuckling, turning to his friends to say something about old fogies, but the words died in his throat before he could get them out. The sound coming from the stage was too real, too full of authority to be ignored. It commanded attention without shouting. It was like a sudden hush falling over a noisy playground when a teacher appears, not because the children are afraid, but because they sense a shift in the air. Arthur didn't rush. He let that first note fade away into nothingness, waiting until the last vibration of the string had stopped completely. Only then did his right hand lift and strike another note. This one was higher, a soft, piercing sound that felt like a question being asked in an empty room. Then his left hand moved, playing a low, rolling chord that filled the bass section with warmth. He wasn't playing a song that anyone recognized. It wasn't a famous classical piece by Mozart or Beethoven, and it wasn't a catchy jazz tune from the radio. It was a melody that seemed to come from nowhere, simple and achingly sad. It moved slowly, wandering through the scales like a person walking through a mist. The notes were not fast or flashy, they were deliberate. Every single one sounded like it had been carefully weighed and measured before being played. The guests near the front began to turn their chairs around. The mocking smiles slid off their faces, replaced by looks of confusion. They had prepared themselves for a train wreck, a terrible performance that they could mock and laugh about later, but this was not terrible. In fact, it was undeniably beautiful. The quality of the tone was astonishing. The way Arthur struck the keys managed to pull a richness out of the instrument that the previous pianist, with all his speed and technical skill, hadn't been able to find. The hired pianist, who had been standing near the curtains with his towel, froze completely. He was a man who understood the mechanics of music. He knew that playing the piano is about more than just hitting the right notes at the right time. He knew about touch, about weight, about using the entire arm to transfer energy into the strings. He watched Arthur's hands closely and saw things that surprised him. He saw that Arthur wasn't playing with just his fingers. He was playing with his whole being. His posture, which had looked so frail and stooped moments ago, suddenly seemed rooted to the bench. There was a hidden strength in the way his arms moved, a fluidity that suggested his muscles remembered exactly what to do, even if his mind had forgotten the last time he sat in front of an audience. As the melody continued, the room transformed. The chatter in the back died down, trickling away like water receding down a drain. Waiters stopped in the aisles, holding silver trays heavy with champagne, their eyes drifting toward the stage. The clinking of ice cubes became the loudest sound in the hall, a noise that suddenly seemed intrusive and rude. People stopped looking at their phones. They stopped checking their watches. They just listened. The music Arthur played felt like a memory. It sounded like the feeling of waking up very early in the morning, before anyone else is awake, and seeing the gray light coming through the curtains. It sounded like looking through an old photo album and seeing faces of people who are no longer there. It was a lullaby, but not for a child. It was a lullaby for adults, for the tired and the lonely, for anyone who had ever lost something they loved. Arthur's eyes were closed tight. He wasn't seeing the chandeliers or the expensive dresses. He was seeing a small, dusty living room from 40 years ago. He was seeing a woman sitting in a worn armchair, her hands folded in her lap, listening to him with a gentle smile on her face. He played for her. He imagined telling her how much he missed her, how the house had been too quiet without her voice, how the colors in the world had seemed a little duller since she left. He poured all of that longing into the keys. Every press of a finger was a word he hadn't been able to speak out loud. The music swelled slightly, climbing up the scale, becoming a little louder, a little more urgent. It was like a wave rising in the ocean. The sound filled every corner of the ballroom, wrapping itself around the pillars and bouncing off the glass windows. It was a sound that demanded that you stop what you were doing and feel something. The young men in the front row, who had been so ready to mock him, were now sitting in silence. One of them was frowning, his brows drawn together as if he were trying to solve a difficult puzzle. The music was confusing him. It was making him feel things he didn't want to feel in a place like this, a place that was supposed to be fun and superficial. The virtuoso pianist felt a shiver run down his spine. He realized that the old man was playing with a depth of emotion that he, the professional, had only ever read about in books. He spent his life practicing scales and arpeggios, trying to make his fingers faster and stronger. He judged his success by how many notes he could play in a second. But Arthur was doing the opposite. He was playing slowly. He was leaving space between the notes. He was letting the silence do as much work as the sound. It was a lesson in humility, and the young man felt small standing there, holding his towel. The melody began to descend, going back down to the lower octaves, softer now. It felt like a sigh. It felt like giving up. The notes became slower, the gaps between them longer. The audience was leaning forward in their seats, afraid that if they moved, they might break the spell. They weren't bored anymore. They were mesmerized. It was as if a storyteller had stood up and started telling a story that belonged to all of them, the story of time passing, of growing old, of love and loss. Arthur's hands moved over the keys with a tenderness that was heartbreaking to watch. His skin was spotted with age, the veins raised and blue, but the touch was light as a feather. He caressed the ivory keys as if they were the cheeks of a sleeping child. There was no aggression in his playing, no ego. It was pure, unfiltered expression. Somewhere in the back of the room, a glass shattered on the floor. A waiter had dropped it. In a normal circumstance, a breaking glass would have caused a scene. People would have turned, stared, maybe whispered. But tonight, nobody turned. The music was too strong. The sound of the glass breaking was just a sharp, tiny punctuation mark in the middle of the ocean of sound, and it was instantly swallowed up. No one cared. The hold that Arthur had on the room was absolute. He transitioned into a new section of the melody, one that felt slightly more hopeful, though it was still tinged with sadness. It was the sound of acceptance. It was the sound of someone realizing that even though the past is gone, it is still beautiful. The notes flowed together, smooth and connected, singing a song that had no lyrics but said everything. The hired pianist realized he was holding his breath. He let it out slowly, his eyes never leaving Arthur's hands. He saw now that the laughter from before had been a mistake. A terrible, foolish mistake. This wasn't a joke. This was the real thing. This was what music was supposed to be. He lowered the towel to his side, his face pale in the dim light of the wings. He knew, with a sudden certainty, that he could not walk out on that stage right now. He could not interrupt this. To do so would be an act of violence against something sacred. So he stayed in the shadows, silent and still, just like everyone else in the room, waiting to see where the old man would take them next. The melody began to change. It was no longer just a quiet, sad confession whispered to an empty room. Slowly, like a tide coming in, the music started to grow. Arthur's left hand began to move with more purpose, digging deeper into the lower keys. The notes became richer, fuller, vibrating against the floorboards so that the guests could feel it in the soles of their expensive shoes. It wasn't a loud volume, it was a heavy volume. It felt like the weight of the music was pressing against their chests, demanding that they pay attention not just with their ears, but with their hearts. The transformation in the room was impossible to ignore. The guests who had been whispering and checking their phones were now completely still. The air in the ballroom, which had been filled with the superficial energy of a cocktail party, was now charged with something real. It was the kind of feeling you get when you walk into an old cathedral or see a sunrise over the ocean, a sense of awe that stops you from thinking about yourself for a few minutes. The arrogance of the wealthy patrons evaporated. In the face of such genuine, raw expression, their designer labels and bank accounts didn't seem to matter at all. Arthur's hands were telling a story now. The right hand played a melody that weaved in and out, dancing over the steady, rolling rhythm of the left. It sounded like a memory of a happy day that had passed long ago. It was sweet, but it had a layer of sorrow underneath it, like gold paint over old wood. The music rose and fell like the breathing of a sleeping giant. There were no fancy tricks, no lightning-fast runs to show off dexterity. It was just pure, honest music. Every note was chosen with care, every silence between the notes felt as important as the sound itself. Near the front, the young man in the tuxedo who had laughed the loudest was now staring at his shoes. His face had turned a shade of red, but not from laughter. He felt a sudden, burning shame. He looked at his hands, resting on the table, and then looked up at the old man on the stage. He realized that he had judged a book by its cover, and he had been terribly wrong. He saw now that the man in the ill-fitting suit possessed a kind of wealth that the young man would probably never understand. The music was stripping away his pride, leaving him feeling small and humble. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was fighting back a lump in his throat, wondering why this music made him want to cry. The hired pianist stood frozen in the shadows. He watched Arthur's technique, or rather, the lack of visible technique. The old man wasn't using the rigid, formal hand posture that is taught in music conservatories. His wrists were loose, his fingers were flat, and he sometimes played with the weight of his whole arm rather than just the strength of his fingers. But the result was a sound that was incredible. The tone was singing, warm, and human. It was the opposite of the cold, perfect performance the young virtuoso had given earlier. The professional pianist realized with a jolt that he had spent years trying to perfect his skill, but he had lost the soul of it along the way. He had learned how to play the piano, but he had forgotten how to make music. Watching Arthur, he felt like he was witnessing a master class in emotion. The music swelled again, louder this time. The chords became more complex, layering on top of each other to create a wall of sound that washed over the audience. It felt like a storm coming, but a storm that you welcome because the air needs to be cleared. The notes climbed higher, sharp and piercing, full of a desperate kind of longing. It was the sound of someone shouting into the wind, hoping that a loved one might hear them from far away. The tension in the ballroom was palpable. People were leaning forward in their seats, their eyes fixed on the stage, their breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the music. In that moment, the barriers between people seemed to dissolve. A CEO sitting next to a waiter was just another human being listening to a song. The man in the cheap suit and the woman in the diamond necklace felt the same pang of longing. The music was a universal language that everyone understood, regardless of who they were or what they owned. It spoke of love and loss, of the passage of time, of the beauty and the pain of being alive. It was a reminder that everyone in the room had someone they missed, something they regretted, and a dream they had let fade away. Arthur's face was a portrait of concentration mixed with deep emotion. His eyes were squeezed shut, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if he were listening to a voice only he could hear. A single tear rolled down his cheek, catching the light from the stage, but he didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. He wasn't performing for them anymore. He had forgotten they were there. He was playing in his own living room, playing for the ghost of the past. He was pouring 50 years of silence into those keys, letting all the stored up pain and love flow out through his fingertips. The melody shifted again, turning softer, more fragile. The heavy chords in the left hand lightened up, becoming gentle ripples. The right hand played a series of high, tinkling notes that sparkled like stars coming out in a night sky. It was a moment of peace, a resolution to the conflict that had been building. It felt like forgiveness. It felt like letting go. The beauty of it was almost physical. It made the hair on people's arms stand up. It sent shivers down their spines. The young pianist felt a wave of admiration wash over him. He saw that this was not just an old man playing a tune, this was an artist speaking his truth. He realized that to interrupt now would be a crime. He leaned back against the velvet curtain, his arms crossed over his chest, and surrendered completely to the sound. He closed his own eyes, letting the music paint pictures in his mind, memories of his childhood, of his mother, of the reason he started playing the piano in the first place before grades and competitions took over. For the first time in years, he remembered why he loved music. The final section of the piece began to build, not in volume, but in intensity. The notes became closer together, rushing forward like a river heading toward a waterfall. It was inevitable, a force of nature that could not be stopped. The audience felt it coming. They held their breath, waiting for the release, knowing that something significant was about to happen. The music took them to the edge of a cliff and held them there, suspended in the air, looking down at the vastness below. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. They were no longer bored socialites, they were travelers on a journey guided by the hands of an old man who had nothing left to lose. The silence that had once mocked him was now a prisoner of his song, held captive by the sheer power of his humanity. The music rushed toward its end like a wave traveling across the ocean, gathering strength and purpose with every beat. Arthur's hands moved together now, playing a series of chords that were both complicated and simple at the same time. The sound filled the entire ballroom, rising up to the high ceiling and bouncing off the walls. It wasn't just noise anymore, it was a physical force that you could feel in your chest. The melody seemed to be saying goodbye to something, or perhaps to someone. It had a feeling of finality to it, like the last page of a book being turned. Arthur leaned into the piano, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. His eyes were still closed tight, blocking out the lights and the people. He wasn't seeing the fancy chandeliers or the expensive dresses. He was seeing a lifetime of memories. He was seeing the face of his wife when she was young, laughing in a sunlit kitchen. He was seeing the years of silence that followed her leaving. He poured all of that, every ounce of love and every bit of the loneliness that came after, into the final phrase of the song. Then, his hand struck the last chord. It was a deep, full sound that used almost every key on the piano. He didn't play it softly. He let it ring out strong and clear, a declaration of everything he had been holding inside for decades. He held his hands down on the keys, letting the note sustain, filling the room with a vibration that felt like the heartbeat of the earth. He didn't lift his fingers immediately. He just sat there, feeling the wood of the piano trembling beneath his palms, letting the sound hang in the air for as long as it possibly could. Slowly, inevitably, the sound began to fade. The vibration grew quieter and quieter until it was just a ghost of a sound, and then, finally, it disappeared into complete silence. Arthur lifted his hands from the keys and placed them gently in his lap. The sudden quietness that followed was absolute. It wasn't the polite silence of people waiting for the next song to start. It was a heavy, profound silence. In a concert hall, when a piece finishes, people usually cough or shuffle their feet. They whisper to their neighbors. But here, nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, afraid that if they made a noise, the magic of the moment would break. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Then 15. It was a strange and powerful feeling. Hundreds of wealthy, important people were sitting in the dark, completely mesmerized by an old man in a cheap suit. The young men who had laughed at him earlier were staring at the floor, their faces red with shame. They felt a knot in their throats that they couldn't swallow away. They realized they had almost missed something beautiful because they were too busy judging the wrapper it came in. Arthur sat on the bench, his shoulders rising and falling as he took a few deep breaths. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving him feeling tired but light. The heavy weight he had carried in his chest for so long was gone. He had said what he needed to say. He had played the song he needed to play. Slowly, he opened his eyes. The spotlight hit his face, making him blink a few times. He looked out at the sea of faces in front of him. For a moment, he looked confused, as if he was waking up from a long dream and didn't know where he was. Then, reality came back. He saw the crowd. He saw the expensive decor. He remembered where he was. A look of panic flickered across his face for a split second. He felt exposed, like he had taken off his clothes in public. He realized that he had just poured his heart out to a room full of strangers. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't want it. He wasn't sure if they would clap, or if they would start laughing again now that the music was gone. He didn't want to see their pity or their judgment. He just wanted to leave. Arthur gripped the edge of the piano bench and pushed himself up. His legs felt a little stiff as he stood. He was just an old man again, his posture slightly bent, his suit looking worn and out of place. He didn't bow. He didn't wave to the audience. He just nodded once, a small, almost apologetic nod to the room, and turned to walk away. As he turned, he saw the hired pianist standing near the side of the stage. The young man was still holding his towel, but he wasn't wiping his hands anymore. He was staring at Arthur with a look of total shock and respect. His professional arrogance had completely vanished. He realized he had just witnessed a master class in emotion. He saw Arthur look at him, and he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The young pianist simply lowered his head and bowed deeply. It was a silent gesture of honor, a way of saying, "I see you, and you are a greater artist than I will ever be." Arthur gave him a tired, faint smile. It was a smile of gratitude. He appreciated that at least one person in the room understood. He didn't say anything, though. He just turned and walked down the 3 steps from the platform. As he walked through the tables, the guests turned their heads to watch him go. Still, nobody clapped. To clap would have felt wrong. Applause is for entertainment, for a show that is put on to please the crowd. This wasn't a show. This was a moment of truth. To clap would have been like clapping at a funeral. It was too serious for that. Instead, people moved out of his way. They parted like the Red Sea, creating a clear path for him through the tables. The young men at the front didn't make eye contact. They looked down at their drinks, wishing the floor would open up and swallow them. The women had tears in their eyes, their makeup smudging slightly as they wiped them away with napkins. Arthur walked with a steady pace, though his heart was beating fast. He wanted to get to the glass entryway. He wanted to feel the cool air on his face. He felt dizzy from the emotion of it all. He kept his eyes focused on the wide glass panels at the far end of the hall. The walk felt like it took a year, but finally, he reached the thick carpet that led to the exit. He pushed open the heavy glass exit door and stepped out into the lobby. The noise of the city street drifted in the sound of cars honking and people talking, but to Arthur, it sounded like a different world. A normal world. A world where people didn't know his pain. Inside the ballroom, the silence remained for almost a full minute after the glass door clicked shut behind him. The guests sat there, looking at the empty piano bench. It was just a piece of furniture now, looking lonely under the spotlight. The magic was gone, but the feeling it left behind stayed with them. They looked at their champagne glasses differently. They looked at each other differently. The evening had changed. It wasn't just a social event anymore. It was a memory they would keep forever. Arthur stood on the sidewalk outside the hotel. He took a deep breath of the night air. It was crisp and cool, refreshing against his warm skin. He buttoned up his jacket. His hands felt empty without the piano keys, but his heart felt full. He stood there for a moment, looking at the stars above the city buildings. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in 30 years. He had done it. He had faced the music, and he had survived. He didn't know where he would go next, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind walking alone.